President Trump threatens to nationalize elections, and today his press secretary says they can't rule out ICE agents at polling places. What's going on? We check in with Congress. Bombshell new reporting shows the infamous Black Hawk apartment raid in South Shore last fall wasn't about capturing alleged Venezuelan gang members. All eyes on Super Bowl Sunday and the halftime entertainment. Puerto Rican-born pop sensation Bad Bunny. Local perspective on why he's become a lightning rod.
And welcome to the Chicago Report on this Thursday evening. I'm Paris Schutz. We interrupt our daily barrage of crazy news to remind you that the 2026 midterm primary election season is here. Certain Illinois residents can get a head start on voting today. Early voting has opened for the March 17th primary, several counties, but for those of us in Chicago, it starts a little later, next Thursday, and you can check your registration and polling place at iwillvote.com. Meanwhile, we're getting a glimpse of what the new and improved O'Hare International Airport Terminal will look like by 2028. Today, the city released a video that animates the expansion project, bringing Concourse D to life for the first time. So this new concourse will be a multi-level space with spots for lounging and dining and shopping, surrounded by windows and skylights for a view of the airfield, with enough space for 19 new gates. But that's not all. It's part of an even bigger multi-billion-dollar expansion project called ORD Next. It includes a new Concourse E as well as a global terminal, and all of it will be connected by another underground tunnel. And back to what's happening nationally, a clip getting a ton of attention online today. It involves U.S. Congressman Jonathan Jackson from right here in Chicago. Congressman Jackson gave a prayer this morning at the annual Washington Prayer Breakfast featuring President Trump and a bipartisan group of lawmakers. Trump used his turn at the podium to go over a familiar list of grievances: Democrats, the media, conspiracy theories of stolen elections. He also called out fellow Republican Congressman Thomas Massie, calling him a, quote, moron. But then it was Jackson's turn to speak at the podium, and take a look at how that went.
We pray that he would be mindful of the poor, and that he would be invested in the alleviation of suffering happening on farms in the Midwest, in the families preparing to bury their loved ones in Minneapolis. Remind him that we are all Americans, all made in the image of God, and that none of us are free unless all of us have our freedoms protected.
So Jackson very subtly offering some criticism of the president through the prayer, but it didn't seem to faze Trump. At the end, they had a cordial exchange, shook hands, and appeared to say, nice job. And last night we heard testimony from Marimar Martinez, the Chicago woman who was shot 5 times by Border Patrol agents in Chicago. Actually, we heard that testimony earlier this week. It won't be her last time in Washington, D.C. She's going to return at the end of the month to attend the State of the Union address with Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia. Now, Martinez testified Tuesday about that near-death experience at a public forum on the actions of immigration agents. We mentioned early voting underway right now for the 2026 primaries, and elections are a hot topic on the Hill. President Trump has repeatedly voiced his desire to, quote, nationalize elections, despite the Constitution clearly articulating elections as a role for state and local authorities. And just today, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said this when asked about the prospect of ICE agents patrolling polling sites.
I can't guarantee that an ICE agent won't be around a polling location in November. I mean, that's frankly a very silly hypothetical question. But what I can tell you is I haven't heard the president discuss any formal plans to put ICE outside of polling locations. It's a disingenuous question.
And this comes as former top Trump strategist Steve Bannon suggested the idea in his podcast. And joining us now is Illinois Congressman Mike Quigley, a Democrat from Chicago. Congressman, this drumbeat about, quote unquote, nationalizing elections and now ICE outside of polling places, what is your reaction to what you're hearing?
It's part of a pattern, right? I mean, this is an administration that's gone after the most basic Voting Rights Act legislation. This administration that has called for new districts to be redrawn, gerrymandered to virtually eliminate Democratic representation in many, many states. The threat of ICE, the threat of going after voting machines, This all follows the president who refused to believe that he lost a lawful election, and he indeed tried to overturn it. So, bottom line, folks, when a tyrant tells you he's going to do something, you better believe him. You better pay attention.
Although I do want to mention the fact that the Supreme Court upheld California's redrawn maps that would portend to favor Democrats. But your colleague in the Senate,
because you don't have unilateral surrender. If Texas is going to do it, California has to. It's a race to the bottom. But Democrats can't sit idly by while they do this.
And Democratic Senator Mark Warner today said he believes that attempts to undermine the 2026 election, potentially some nefarious activity is already underway. Do you have any idea what he might be referring to?
It could be referring to a whole bunch of things. But look, the intimidation goes on, not just in what we've talked about already, but the fact that ODNI went down to Georgia as part of this whatever kind of raid the FBI did, still looks back as to what happened and their false belief that that election was stolen, where Trump lost to Biden, and basically intimidating the entire election process and election workers. It's not going to be easy for them to understand why they should go through this after what all those workers in Georgia went through. And they're clearly sending a reminder of that.
And related, there have been some shifting explanations for why the National Intelligence Chief, Tulsi Gabbard, was in Fulton County, Georgia, during an apparent raid on ballots and the election site there. First, she says she was there at the direction of the president. The president then said he didn't know about it and it was at the direction of the DOJ. What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, it would be bizarre, twisted, and confused if the Department of Justice asked the ODNI, the head of the person who coordinates all our national security efforts, to go to Georgia on an election raid by the FBI. None of it makes sense. It only sends one message. The person in charge, our intelligence network, is down there. If that's not meant to intimidate, I don't know what is.
At the same time, Republicans in the House and Senate, most of the Republican leaders, Senator John Thune says he's not in favor of, quote unquote, nationalizing elections, assuming something like that could even be constitutional. But they do support the SAVE Act, which would mandate voter ID nationwide. Illinois, one of a handful of states that does not require voter ID. Why are Democrats against this?
Look, it would just make it a lot more difficult to vote, which is part of their pattern. It does things that says that people who aren't citizens of the U.S. can't vote. Well, they can't vote anyway. I mean, the fact that they put it in there is telling people that maybe they think that they can. So it's redundant in that respect, but it also makes it far more difficult if you get into it. It's not just a question of the ID. If someone, for example, has ever changed their name, the complexities of getting registered to vote are going to be so extraordinary. It also makes it very difficult to register to vote online. We're trying, voter fraud in this country, and I know we're from Chicago, but in the last 20 years, voter fraud is is so infinitesimally small. They're really not finding it. This is just a way to discourage voting. It's in many of these respects a harken back to the old days of Jim Crow. If you can't win an election fair and square, find some way to make it very difficult for those who oppose you to get out and vote. They know what they're doing.
And there has not been evidence of widespread voter fraud. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have confirmed that. And in every election, the U.S. Attorney's Office has a voter integrity unit. They monitor these things. They investigate these things. Every now and then they find a handful of cases of people wrongly registered, but nothing widespread on the scope of overturning any kind of election. Let's shift gears to the DHS funding package, funding for ICE. Is the likeliest outcome here another extension here? Because it doesn't seem like Republicans or Democrats are going to agree on how to go forward.
I think that's right. But even to get an extension, a continuing resolution, as we call it, they're going to need some Democratic support in the Senate. They've done it before in the House because they have a majority, although they can only lose by one vote now, 218 to 214, for those of you keeping score at home. So I think the most likely outcome right now is at least a temporary, partial government shutdown of DHS. But I think we should stress that what the Democrats are asking for are simply reforms that are akin to what almost every police force in the country abides by, right? They have to use search warrants. They can't wear face masks. There are codes of conduct, the codes that restrict the use of force, at least some minimal, de minimis coordination with local and statewide law enforcement here. Otherwise, it's extraordinarily dangerous, and people are dying. So Democrats are willing to go along with the partial government shutdown if there can't be some changes. And frankly, with this administration, I don't have any faith, any trust that they will actually enact that. So fool me once or twice, shame on you. But if we trust them anymore, it's going to be our own fault.
At the same time, Republicans have opposed all those reforms you mentioned, and their big push is to end sanctuary cities. Is there a compromise that Democrats would strike on sanctuary protections?
Look, the problem of what they're going after strikes against a real basis of law enforcement and the division that you want from law enforcement and ICE. I was at the domestic violence courthouse right here in Chicago, and we talked to advocates. When ICE went there, women left and weren't going to come back to get orders of protection or to get the justice they deserve. The calls to 911 in Pilsen and Little Village went down 20 to 30%. If people are afraid to call local law enforcement because of the connection, and that's what they want, to get rid of sanctuary cities, we're going to be less safe. This isn't about making us more secure. It's about scaring people.
All right, Congressman Mike Quigley joining us from Capitol Hill. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And on that note, remember the wild Black Hawk helicopter raid in South Shore last fall? Well, the Department of Homeland Security claimed that heavily hyped operation was meant to grab known Venezuelan gang members who were living there. But then ProPublica got on the case. They reported it out, and turned out there really weren't any known gang members arrested. And yesterday, ProPublica put out their latest investigation that shows, in the government's own words, the operation was really about going after squatters, not gang members, possibly on a tip from the building's landlord. And joining us now is ProPublica reporter Jody Cohen. Jody, hi. Thanks for speaking with us. You and ProPublica have really been researching what happened here. And we've all seen the images, and we'll show them again. But remind us the scope of this raid, what happened, and how many people were detained.
So this was a very large operation back at the end of September. Remember it because it was in the middle of the night. It started around midnight. There was Black Hawk helicopters rappelling into the building, hundreds of agents, and like you can see in the images, just a lot of activity there. And in the end, it also was televised with a camera crew. It was kind of like this made for TV spectacle. And they paraded out immigrants and in the end detained 37 individuals.
Yeah, and it seems like there were camera crews following Mr. Bovino everywhere he went. The content creation,
Right.
Putting out hype videos was a big part of Operation Midway Blitz. And at the time, even Stephen Miller in the White House said dozens of known Tren de Aragua gang members were detained. Turns out either he was lying or he was misinformed by somebody. That wasn't the case, was it?
Right. What they said to the camera crews before and after was that they were there because this building had been taken over by a Venezuelan gang, that they were there to make the community safer, the South Shore community. And what we were able to report this week was that through arrest records of some of the men who were taken that night, where the government writes a narrative of what preceded the arrest, what they wrote was nothing about there being gangs as the reason they went to this building. What they wrote was that they had intelligence that there were people unlawfully occupying apartments, that there were squatters in the building. And that was why they went into, that's what they wrote as why they chose this building.
Right, and that's what you put out this week. At the time, they made a big case saying there was intel that it had been taken over by gang members. Turns out it had been maybe taken over by squatters. Do you know why the discrepancy in what was written down and what you discovered and what they had said publicly?
Well, we've asked them numerous times, as have other media, why, they say that there were gang members. Show us the evidence. They have said that they arrested 2 people who were known members of a foreign terrorist organization. We have said, who are they? What is the evidence? Lots of people have asked them. They've not provided that evidence. There was suspicion from the very beginning that it was the landlord and or the building manager who had informed the federal government, ICE or others, that this building, that there were immigrants living in this building. The building had been a trouble spot for a long time. There was some criminal activity, and that the building had been it was really a mess. There was constant 311, 911 calls. The elevators didn't work. The lights didn't work. And the landlord was in foreclosure proceedings. So there was suspicion from the beginning that there was cooperation to allow agents into this building, but it was not confirmed. People just suspected it. The residents suspected it. However, through these arrest records, the government wrote that the landlord and the building manager provided permission to enter and search the building. So it was really the first time that we had government confirmation, which they and the landlord and building owner manager had not said before.
Right.
They had not acknowledged that before.
And this is official records, arrest records that you pulled and basically quoted. And at the same time, I remember when this was happening and reporters started going down there and talking to people, and they were just like shell-shocked at what had happened, being detained, and Black Hawk helicopter and rappelling, and then folks just rampaging throughout that building. It's just an amazing scene. But the state is investigating right now whether the landlord tipped the feds off. It seems like there's pretty clear evidence from what you're citing that at least the landlord or the building manager had a pretty clear role in coordinating with the federal government. Where is that investigation right now? And what's the potential wrongdoing if it indeed is confirmed that the landlord set this whole thing off?
So just a couple of weeks ago, the state's Department of Human Rights opened up an investigation. They launched an investigation looking at discrimination. It's a discrimination investigation into the landlord company and the property management company to see whether they were involved in this as a way of discriminating against Black and Hispanic residents who were living there as a way to get them out. So it's a discrimination complaint, and it just got started. We checked in with them this week. They're waiting for a response back from the companies. So it's very much in the early stages.
And I know there's been reporting on the horrible conditions in that building going on for a long time, neglect, almost like slumlord type of conditions. What is the status of that building now?
Oh, good question. So after there was so much attention on it, and the property management company hired security guards who then they quickly fired. Long story short, the building was in foreclosure. The judge in November took the building away from them, from the management company, appointed a receiver to manage the building, and then ordered that all residents leave the building in December. She said it was too unsafe, that people could not live in that building. It was not safe for them, and everybody was forced to leave the building and find other places to live. So the building is currently not occupied.
Well, this will always kind of, I think, for years remain sort of some of the core images of Operation Midway Blitz. Jody Cohen, we know that you and your colleagues at ProPublica will be continuing to look into what exactly happened. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Paris.
You got it. Well, when we come back, the Super Bowl and maybe more importantly, the halftime show, Bad Bunny preparing to take the stage. We're breaking down the buzz right after this.
the opportunity to bring that feeling that I put on that album to one of the biggest stage in the world is something that I never thought.
That's Puerto Rican-born superstar of pop, Benito Ocasio, better known as Bad Bunny. He's going to take the stage at halftime, and it's caused quite a sensation, both good and bad. Some Republicans have noted his comments on immigration and critical of the Trump administration as reasons they won't be tuning into halftime and will instead try to find some other entertainment. And we're joined now by Danielle Roper, professor of Latin American literature at the University of Chicago, who is an expert on Latin American and Caribbean culture. Thanks so much for joining us, Danielle Roper. I can't remember the last time there was just so much controversy swirling around a halftime performance, maybe since the wardrobe malfunction so many years ago. Those of us old enough to remember that will know what that means. But first of all, remind us, for the uninitiated, who is Benito Ocasio, Bad Bunny, and why has he become such a cultural sensation internationally?
Bad Bunny is a reggaeton artist from Puerto Rico whose music has taken the world by storm. He has been on a kind of consistent rise since about, let's say, 2016, probably actually earlier, but his music, he's the most streamed artist. In 2025, he was the most streamed artist in the world. He has since now won the album. He's the first person to win Album of the Year with an album that was in an all Spanish language album. So Bad Bunny has really kind of, in the last couple of years, I mean, he has taken the world by storm. It is not an understatement. One of the things that makes Bad Bunny so I guess controversial in some circles, but I would say so popular, so impressive, is that he refuses to be anybody but himself. He is mostly, he speaks in Spanish. He's one of these artists who, upon crossing over to the mainstream English speaking media, refused to speak English. If we think about artists like Shakira, Enrique Iglesias, a lot of these artists, upon hitting, kind of the mainstream market, switched to English. He has refused to sing in anything but Spanish. Until quite recently, his English was actually very limited. And so what makes him such a kind of key figure for Spanish-speaking U.S. citizens, for Latino and immigrant communities, is that he is defiant. He refuses to assimilate. He is going to be himself in any context, and his success pushes against this narrative that you need to assimilate, that you need to speak English to somehow gain the kind of recognition and legitimacy on the global mainstream music stage. So that is what I think has propelled him to fame.
It's certainly a groundbreaking artist, and tens of millions have watched him win the Grammy and give some very poignant statements about his concerns about the immigration operations and ICE. Give us a sense of his activism. You mentioned he refuses to assimilate. His music is in Spanish, but he has been out there and outspoken. He won't tour the United States, for instance, because he doesn't want his fans to be subjected to ICE.
Yes. So Bad Bunny is a quintessential colonial subject. We have to remember that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but they don't get the kind of rights that ordinary U.S. citizens get. And so from the very get-go, he's somebody who grew up under a colonial regime in Puerto Rico. So if you track his career, he has always been outspoken. He was outspoken about the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. This is when the U.S. established a fiscal board in 2016 to take over Puerto Rico's money. So Puerto Rico's economy, all of their wealth goes to the U.S., is controlled by a board from outside, from the United States. And so what you have is a colonial subject who has been critical of the role that U.S. has played in limiting Puerto Rican sovereignty. So this is a subject who speaks about the U.S. as an empire, which is something that a lot of, U.S. citizens living in the mainland don't really tend to recognize, that this is actually a colonial relationship. The second thing is that he was critical of the Trump administration's response for Hurricane Maria. People forget this because they think this new discussion or this new critique of ICE is somehow new to his career. It absolutely is not. He spoke out against the Trump administration's response to Hurricane Maria. And so now when you look at his critique of ICE, what you have is a colonial subject who is critical of all of the problems in how the U.S. has conducted its relationship to countries in the Caribbean and Latin America. And he's critical of how that has impacted people, Spanish-speaking U.S. citizens, and people living in this community. So we have to think about him as a voice of resistance, right, in this moment.
Certainly an interesting confluence of art, music, and politics at this moment. All right, Danielle Roper, professor at UChicago, thanks very much for joining us. And we are out of time. Have a great weekend, everybody. Good night.